The following is a production of Everett Public Library in Everett, Washington. Welcome to Smokestack Soundbites, audio stories from Everett Public Library about the history and life of our city and our county. Everett once proudly adopted the nickname the City of Smokestacks for its many smoke-belching mills. We have changed since then, and we hope our soundbites will give insight into who and what Everett and Snohomish County have been, from then until now. Though he died in 1985, you can still find people in Snohomish County who remember John Patric. Find one of these people and the stories pour out. He's the guy that tweaked the nose of the powers that be, who mailed dead birds and fishtails to people, who was sentenced to 10 years for signing a false name on an initiative petition, who ran for political offices high and low with no chance of winning. He was that guy that wrote that newsletter, and the guy that was put on trial for being crazy. Let's digress, though. Who was John Patric, and why would people think him insane?
Patric was born in the town of Snohomish in 1902. His father owned a hardware store and his mother was a librarian at the Snohomish Library. He styled himself a hobo and beginning in his teens hitchhiked and rode the rails, financing his travels with occasional work as a printer or rubber stamp salesman. He attended college piecemeal, studying journalism a semester at a time in Washington, Oregon, North Carolina, and Texas. It was at the University of Texas in the early 1930s where his curmudgeonly streak was first spectacularly revealed. Patric wrote a series of caustic columns in the student newspaper under the pen name of Simon Legree. Student body president Alan Shivers confronted Patric, and the pair had a fist fight. Shivers won and went on to be a multiple-term governor of Texas. Patric was expelled.
In the 1930s and 40s, Patric continued his travels, authoring long, impressive articles about foreign countries as a staff writer with National Geographic. He sparred with editors who liked his reporting but wanted to edit out his cranky libertarian diversions. He later worked for Reader's Digest, where he wrote a sort of secret shopper feature, exposing rip-off repair businesses that nearly always overcharged or did unneeded work. When World War II began, he offered his services to the government as an intelligence operative, but was spurned. In 1941, he bought a 160-acre parcel in the middle of the National Forest, northeast of Florence, Oregon. For the next 15 years, he lived on and off in a trailer there, along Frying Pan Creek.
In 1943 saw commercial publication of his best book, Why Japan Was Strong, based on his travels in Asia during the 1930s. In 1945, Patric republished the book himself, resetting it, hiring his own illustrators, and renaming it Yankee Hobo in the Orient. When he was not traveling, he was working at Frying Pan Creek on his never-to-be-published manuscript, The Hobo Years. Family problems led to his return to his hometown in Snohomish in 1957. Within months, he had launched that newsletter, his blistering attack rag, the Snohomish County Free Press, later renamed the Saturday Evening Free Press. Historian David Ilgard of Everett Public Library had this to say about the origin of Patric's newsletter.
He returned to Snohomish to find his hometown awash in what he saw as unparalleled political corruption. Initially going full tilt against a proposed sewage lagoon, Patric quickly expanded his enemies' list to include undertakers, junk mail, city cops, and politicians in general. The free press was his weapon of choice, and before long, he discarded the hectograph's gelatin in a Johnny Cake tin for a linotype set copy and an offset press.
Patric's attacks on local politicians mostly consisted of crude, name-calling tirades. He had his own names for local officials he was lambasting: Gorilla Brain Boyd, Zoot Zoot Zimple, Boxcar Worst Tongue, Ponch Adams the Cop Commissar, Slickford, Call Me a Full Colonel Cocky, Flim Flamsburg, Moon the Cesspool Kid, among others. Everyone knew who he was talking about, and everyone was offended, and frequently they acted. In April 1958, after only 4 issues of the Free Press, Snohomish Police Chief Clarence Boyd acted by filing a complaint alleging that Patric was mentally incompetent. After a hearing in Snohomish County Superior Court, Judge Edward Nollmeyer signed an order requiring Patric to undergo 60 days of observation at the Bug House, Northern State Hospital for the Insane in Sedro-Woolley, one of the state's mental hospitals.
For the next 6 months, Patric was examined by staff psychiatrists while being shuttled between Northern State and the Snohomish County Jail. The psychiatrists that examined him concluded he was a paranoid schizophrenic. The Prosser Record Bulletin interviewed Patric about his treatment during this ordeal.
Patric was first placed in a receiving ward but was allowed to see only his 82-year-old mother, Mrs. Emma Patric of Snohomish, and then not privately but with a doctor in attendance. After a few weeks of this, he was sent back to solitary confinement in Snohomish County Jail, whereupon Payne Carr, Seattle member of the American College of Trial Lawyers, demanded a jury trial. At this point, Patric was allowed to have his typewriter and proceeded to write letters to friends throughout the country telling of this state of affairs. When asked how he had been treated at the hospital, Patric stated that he had been placed in solitary confinement 8 times with his belt, blanket, and glasses taken from him. Ward 4, he said, is a hellhole. Patients must sit all day on hard-bottom chairs and are allowed only 3 hours a week outdoors.
On July 24, 1958, Charles H. Jones, superintendent of Northern State Hospital for the Insane, sent a letter to Judge Nollmeyer assessing Patric's mental state. Patric published the text of this letter in the Saturday Evening Free Press several years later.
As this case developed, it became quite apparent to me that the problem was one commonly, though rather infrequently, seen in mental hospitals, namely the differential diagnosis between paranoid personality, involutional paranoid psychotic reaction, and paranoid schizophrenia. However, there is no question but what Mr. Patric is psychotic, and that the consensus of opinion is that he is dangerous to be at large. My diagnosis is schizophrenia paranoid type. This is quite evident by the patient's grandiosity and the purposelessness of his actions in responding to his paranoid delusion systems. As Mr. Patric feels justified in any action he takes, the grandiose nature of his delusions is such that I regard him to be extremely dangerous to be at large. There is no telling at what time he might impulsively take action which might result in physical or mental harm to innocent bystanders. This is the type of case which is often difficult to secure commitment from a jury, as there are certain parts of his personality intact, such as memory and general intelligence. However, I feel that involuntary hospitalization as a mentally ill person is the only recommendation which can be realistically made in this case.
An involuntary commitment law like the one applied to Patric is still in the books in Washington State, albeit with more safeguards. Under RCW 7105, mental health professionals, not police chiefs, may file a petition for involuntary commitment. In 1958, however, Patric found himself cut off from the outside world, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Then, as now, the law permitted involuntarily committed patients to request a trial by jury to determine the matter of their sanity. In Patric's case, the trial was held in Snohomish County Superior Court in late September 1958. Patric conducted his own defense, cross-examining the doctors that had judged him insane. The trial was a spectacle, drew hundreds of spectators, and captured press attention, both in Washington State and elsewhere. Next, trial and testimony. The insanity trial of John Patric opened on September 23, 1958 in Snohomish County Superior Court, Judge Edward Nollmeyer presiding. The impending trial had gotten a lot of press, and a sizable gallery was on hand to watch the show. Patric acted as his own attorney and sparred with the judge at every opportunity. He warned jurors that what happened to me could happen to any one of you. The Everett Daily Herald noted,
Patric questioned most of the jurors about their belief in an American's inherent right to be different or unorthodox. His defense against the insanity charge is based on his contention that eccentricity is not only sane and lawful, but sometimes needed.
Judge Nollmeyer had granted Patric the right to subpoena witnesses, and Patric quickly went on the attack in cross-examining at length Dr. Lowell R. Hughes, Northern State's assistant superintendent.
The report from Northern State Hospital included the minutes of a staff meeting at which the physicians and psychiatrists discussed Patric's alleged insanity. Patric, in cross-examining Dr. Hughes, pointed out disagreements among the doctors about the degree of his alleged mental illness and potential danger to society.
Under Patric's questioning, Hughes claimed to be an expert in what is good and bad judgment in patients, and said Patric's illness is his deterioration in judgment. Patric questioned Hughes' own judgment and said his crusades and behavior were not delusions of grandeur, as Hughes implied, but were instead Patric's attempt to better his community and world. Snohomish Police Chief Clarence Boyd, Snohomish Grocer Carl Cummings, and Postal Inspector Franklin Wood also testified. Admitted into evidence were dozens of letters and postcards Patric had written, copies of books he had written, and a copy of Who's Who in America, in which Patric is listed as a libertarian writer. The Colorado Springs Gazette-Telegraph described the prosecution's case and Patric's response.
At the trial, a number of items were brought up which were supposed to show that Mr. Patric was mentally unbalanced. For example, it was shown that he had begun to frank his own mail, a privilege supposedly reserved for the members of Congress. Patric contended that if senators and congressmen could send mail to him that didn't interest him, he should be able to reverse the process, and the taxpayers would be equally bound to respect his wishes. He was accused in an instance of mailing a fishtail and a dead robin to certain parties, franked, of course. He retaliated by saying that if others could send junk mail at the public expense, then he should have the same privilege.
The Herald's report of Day 3 of the trial described Patric's demeanor.
The bushy, bearded author, who psychiatrists called psychotic and dangerous, dramatically played his role as defendant and defense attorney to the hilt. He time and time again interrupted the prosecutor and witnesses to ask them to speak loudly enough for the audience to hear. Patric's antics, which have put the city of Snohomish in a tizzy and gained widespread attention, were defended by two of his friends, an Olympia newspaperman and an Everett proofreader, as the sanity trial of the bearded Snohomish author continued.
Dean Shacklett, reporter for the Daily Olympian, testified that he thought Patric had deliberately misused the federal mail franking privilege in order to instigate a test court case. Eric Baxendale, Snohomish resident employed as a proofreader in Everett, told the jury of 3 women and 9 men that, "If John Patric's insane, I'd like to be just as insane myself." Baxendale defended Patric's hundreds of crank letters about problems created by the U.S. Post Office, Snohomish city officials, lagoon sewer systems, and lack of curfew for teenagers. He said he believed that all Patric's letters were based on a constructive idea or opinion.
Patric again disputed psychiatrists' claims that his crusades were pointless and his antics endangered people and property. He said instead that all his pranks were designed to further his political crusades and did no permanent damage to anyone. The Herald called Patric's self-defense skillful. For 4 hours, he related sometimes humorous anecdotes about his life to murmurs of approval from the overflow audience whenever he seemed to win a point. He claimed his great-great-grandfather served with Washington at Valley Forge, On recess, he chatted with friends, posed for television cameramen, and played the celebrity with starstruck students that approached him.
Some said that John Patric had missed his calling. He should have been a lawyer. The bearded Snohomish author, termed insane by state psychiatrists, seemed to bear out that belief as he skillfully conducted his own courtroom defense this week. He thanked each witness for appearing. He apologized to the judge and prosecutor for his lack of legal training and thanked them for their help. And he insisted on speaking so that all courtroom spectators could hear him. The rambling life of an admitted eccentric and nonconformist writer with a yen for travel was outlined to jurors in a lengthy chronological history with stops for sharp vignettes. Many of Patric's stories involved persons such as Mussolini and Texas Governor Allen Shivers.
On the trial's final day, September 27, 1958, prosecution and defense made final arguments to the jury. Deputy Prosecutor Bob Ashley challenged the jurors to take responsibility for Patric's fate. "Mental illness is unfortunately a fact. We have to face it," he said. Patric argued that Americans have an inherent right to hold beliefs outside the mainstream and urged them not to forget what will happen to me if his commitment stood.
Patric ended by reciting Rudyard Kipling's poem Recessional, which was written in 1897 on the occasion of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Composed at the height of the British Empire's power, it conjured images of that empire crumbling into dust because of its arrogance, implying that this court and our nation could suffer the same fate were they to be so arrogant as to judge Patric insane. One stanza:
"Far called our navies melt away, on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget."
Next, verdict and aftermath. September 27, 1958, a Snohomish County Superior Court jury deliberated only 12 minutes before unanimously returning a verdict declaring John Patric legally sane. He was immediately released. The Everett Herald described the scene.
Apparently, the jury members did not take time to review much of the hundreds of letters and cards and lengthy medical reports entered as evidence. Very few of the near 100 spectators jamming the courtroom had left their seats before the jury returned from their deliberations. Patric appeared calm as the jury returned and expressed no great show of emotion when the verdict was read. He smiled broadly, however, when many of the audience came forward to congratulate him.
The Shingle Weaver, a union newspaper from Portland, Oregon, had this to say about the acquittal in its November 1958 edition.
"Patric is an eccentric. He wears a beard. He cares little for money as such, as long as he has the basic necessities of life. He doesn't give a tinker's damn for the conventionalities of life. If he thinks you're a stinker, he'd just as soon tell you to your face as behind your back." Crazy? Sure, John Patric, a self-termed screwball, may be crazy in the addled thinking of those who believe that sanity equates only with doing as one's neighbors do. But he's a mighty sane man all the same, for he has the balance, the courage, and the moral fortitude to set up his own goals in his own way, and then to seek them, regardless of what the world thinks, and regardless of the enemies, and even of the friends he makes in the process.
After the verdict, Patric often boasted that he was the only sane person around and had a jury's verdict to prove it. His acquittal had one immediate effect. The trial's publicity had generated subscription requests from around the country, giving the Free Press a nationwide, if not a mass, following. As a result, Patric changed the name of his publication from Snohomish County Free Press to Saturday Evening Free Press. This sometimes mimeographed, sometimes typeset, always caustic publication continued into the 1970s.
Patric continued to generate not only a newsletter, but also news, as his career as a professional provocateur continued. Patric told the Seattle Times that as of 1975, he'd appeared in various courts 67 times.
He was charged with various mail fraud incidents, hitchhiking in front of his own home, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace. For a time, he expressed his displeasure with the Postal Service by sending out his newsletter with postage rendered in 1-cent stamps, so the post office would have to cancel each. In 1962, Patric was convicted of signing a false name on an initiative petition, his well-known pseudonym Hugo N. Fry, and was sentenced to 10 years in prison by an irate judge. The verdict was later overturned on appeal to the Washington State Supreme Court.
The Seattle Times' Eric Lacidus profiled Patric's career as of December 1975.
Over the years, Patric's nonconformity has angered many persons. In Snohomish, he has been attacked several times. In 1974, someone hit Patric on the head with a blunt instrument, knocking the old man unconscious and opening a 2-stitch gash in his scalp. Patric also says he has been the victim of fires set by his enemies. His home in Snohomish has been destroyed by 3 fires in the past 3 years. The Snohomish City Fire Department says the latest fire was probably started when a wood stove in a shed ignited combustibles. Cause for the previous 2 fires, the department says, is undetermined. One city official says he can understand why Patric has been the victim of violence. The townspeople, the official says, are about 100 to 1 against him.
Though apparently unpopular in his hometown, Patric had friends and supporters. For example, after his house burned down and the city of Snohomish issued an abatement order to clean up the site, these supporters emerged and cleared the site. In addition to all his pranks and publicity stunts, Patric also ran for political offices, lots of them. Governor, U.S. Senator, Snohomish City Council, School Board, Mayor, Secretary of State, whichever office drew his attention. He said he wasn't running to win office, but because he wanted to earn the right to criticize opponents freely.
Patric joked with Seattle Times columnist Rick Anderson about these so-called campaigns, saying he not only didn't run for office, he didn't even crawl. In fact, he'd do whatever it took not to win. Losing has its good points, Patric explained. This way, you have something to look forward to next time.
In the years following the verdict, Patric could frequently be seen in Everett selling free presses from a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Everett Public Library historian David Dilgard knew Patric during these years and had this to say about Patric's habits.
John's lifestyle, including his diet, was highly idiosyncratic, and he was a heavy smoker. The brief glimpses I got of his eating habits were startling. He apparently subsisted at times on canned mackerel and chocolate bars, washed down with large quantities of coffee.
Patric sickened in the early 1980s and was confined to a nursing home. He died at 83 years old on September 27, 1985, 27 years to the day after he was declared legally sane by a jury of his peers. Dilgard agreed with Patric when the aging curmudgeon compared himself with Diogenes the Cynic, also known as Diogenes of Sinope, a Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC.
Although it may sound pretentious, his comparison of himself to the cynic Diogenes was pretty convincing to me. Like Diogenes, his lifestyle was austere, and he spent a lot of his time looking for honesty and virtue in his fellow man and loudly proclaiming that he had failed to find it. I did a memorial tribute to him some years ago that I titled The Diogenes of Avenue D. His house once stood on Avenue D in Snohomish. I know he was in a care facility at the end of his life, no longer able to walk his usual rounds through the area. The loss of mobility alone might have killed him. He was fiercely self-sufficient and compulsively peripatetic, and there's no way he could have survived being bedridden.
Lawrence W. Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education wrote an homage to Patric in 2016 and offered some fitting final words.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify them or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Patric was cremated, and his remains lie in the GAR Cemetery in Snohomish, a town he referred to as the cesspool town on the skids. Patric's tombstone shows this inscription under the embossed image of a soaring eagle.
John Patric, Hugo N. Fry, 1902 to 1985. A little eccentric, but justified.
Copies of John Patric's Saturday Evening Free Press are rare today. None appear in library catalogs in Washington State or anywhere else. The issues that have come to light over the years have survived in musty attics of Patric's small but devoted band of subscribers. For 40 years, the Everett Public Library has solicited and unearthed issues of the Free Press, aiming to gain insight into Patric and his journalistic war against what he saw as corruption and venality in the town of Snohomish and beyond. The Free Press began in 1957 and ended publication sometime in the 1970s. It was a crudely produced publication, a single 8.5 by 11-inch page, mimeographed on one side and printed on the other via photo offset technology or via a sometimes functional linotype machine, which he called the K9, or just the dog. The printed side often included things like display ads, facsimiles of front pages of newspapers or several newspaper stories, interspersed with Patric's typewritten or handwritten comments about the inclusions. Free Press cost a dime an issue, $5.20 for a year's subscription, or, as he liked to say, 52 Free Press dimes. Today, Patric would be a blogger and culture jammer, a royal pain in the rear to an even larger audience than he ever had in the era of clacking typewriters. Patric's words were his weapons. Free Press was a spare, ferocious publication, angry, clever, insulting, and sometimes even informative. Within its pages, he used a number of pen names, the most frequent being Hugo N. Fry, the use of which nearly got him 10 years in prison. Patric's focus was the misdeeds he perceived in the town of Snohomish, which he called Sodomish, after the biblical Sodom, the cesspool town on the skids. Cesspool came from the city's paying for its new sewage plant via municipal bonds. Patric had the idea that the town's fathers were enriching themselves at taxpayer expense. This launched his 20-year-long serial crusade on behalf of the little guy. The publication started as the Snohomish County Free Press, but its appeal spread until he had more subscribers from out of state than within. Patric claimed that the Saturday Evening Free Press had paid subscribers from Oregon, Maine, California, Alaska, Arizona, Illinois, Virginia, Missouri, North Carolina, New York, New Mexico, Florida, and Nevada, and Old Mexico as well. Somehow, Free Press published every week for roughly 20 years. Patric often wrote that the Free Press, begun with a 10-triangle pawnshop typewriter, hectograph gelatin, in a Johnny Cake tin. There's no better way to tell you what Free Press was about than Patric's own words in Free Press. What follows is a selection. We have no recording of Patric's actual voice, so the library's Van Ramsey provides an interpretation.
There
once was a little town in a young state, with too many saloons and too many churches, too many racketeering cops, and too many grafting politicians. This little town had 2 newspapers, large and filled with advertising for Jippo merchants, tax evaders, overpriced junk the little guy would be better off without. Hamlin was infested with sewer gangsters, like rats. Nothing could be done about them until the Pied Piper had the same weird fascination for the rats of Hamlin that money has for the sewer gangsters today. The shabby old Free Press editor peddles his little papers in restaurants, taverns, all of his native Snohomish County as he can. Week after week, we visit these places along the entire length of Hewitt Avenue. We've been ordered to scram from some disorderly places because we persist in countering smart-alecky free speech with even sharper free speech of our own. We've been thrown out of drunk-filled saloons operated by FOE and American Legion in Snohomish. The Free Press is the only paper in the United States not afraid to fight for the unorganized little guy, for the liberty-loving individual against all the racketeers at once. Politicians, warlords, advertising pitchmen, labor goons, ecclesiastical bums, crooked cops, saloon keepers, undertakers, injustices, loan sharks, shyster lawyers, quack docs, uneducators, Jippo junk bailers, and all the rest of our human vermin who, privately referring to you and me as suckers, get rich by preying upon us because we're plain damned fools. The Free Press is not written down to morons, imbeciles, or even boobs. If your name be Zoot Suit Zimple, Gorilla Brain Boyd, Boxcar Worst Hung, Paunch Adams the Cop Commissar, Slickford Call Me a Full Colonel Cocky, Flim Flamsburg, Moon the Cesspool Kid, etc., don't read this. It'll be over your head. Since we deeply distrust that sleazy old sewer gangster Harris Heel of the Sewer Gangsters Bank, which slipped a big stockholder onto Snohomish City Council about the era when the Sewer Gangsters Bank bought the tax-exempt big cesspool bonds, we wouldn't put even one of Dave Sherwood's wooden centennial nickels, even if we had one, which we ain't, into Harris Heel's bank. This time, the Snohomish cop who'd called on us said that we had referred to his wife by a foul epithet from the Vulgate. The word is one we've never used, either in our speech or writing. We have no information about, nor quarrel with, the cop's wife. The husky cop slammed a bare-fisted right to the left jaw. It was a knockout blow. When we revived, maybe 15 minutes later, our glasses lay 6 feet away. We had not been asked to remove them. Whether facial injuries above the swollen jaw were the result of our fall after the blow, or by kicks from our assailant after we lay unconscious, we cannot know for sure. The Free Press charges that 40 men in the upper jail tank aren't allowed to go to toilets all night long, forced to defecate in coverless, battered old water buckets, so that by morning stench is akin to that of Lake Worsting, Free Press name for Moon's Lagoon, the great new cesspool in Snohomish on the Skids. It's some progress when gang inside pass out first huge gunny sack of swag to gang on outside, with hoarse whisper, "There's more where this came from. Folks here all drunk, watching sports events on TV." Free Press begun with a 10-triangle pawn shop typewriter, hectograph gelatin and Johnny Cake tin, now in 5th year of publication. It survived 1. Jailings by politicians on many phony charges, including even insanity. 2. 43 costly court appearances. 3. Many physical attacks on editor, including 1 broken jaw by Snohomish policemen. 4. Plant house equipment wreckage, also by cops. Saturday evening Free Press always pays light bill promptly, but we object strenuously to paying also for boob-pitched hogwash dumped on us at our expense by Pork Utility District Commissars Black, Barry, Quast, and Pork Utility District overpaid bossman A.J. Steele to tell us boobs how good they are. Chasing us out of the Blue Diamond, he attacked us savagely on the street, where in full view of Kenny Burley, this husky young regular customer administered another of the beatings this editor monotonously gets from time to time. First blow knocked our glasses off and onto the street. Luckily, they did not break. This editor has a temper of ice. We simply stood there and took it, blow after blow, standing up to it, never lifted a finger against Kenny Burley's regular customer who must watch TV and know that good guys can always lick villains like Patrick. Free Press adds toughest scrap against multi-billionaire natural gas gang. It's gargantuan ditch digger ruined park strip we were restoring here. We sprinkled Diggerman Olmdahl with garden hose on warm afternoon. After discussion with him, be sure there'd be no hard feelings, no violence. Olmdahl told us he enjoyed sprinkling, liked books we gave him. He was first visitor when billionaire gas gang got us in jail. Indian need fish money bad. Indian need money to buy shoes for squaw and little Indians. Long time Indian go barefoot. If Indian go barefoot now, barefoot Indian cut feet on broken beer bottles. We glad Judge Hill and Judge Ott say Indian can use old way catch fish. Now squaw can trap fish so us braves can potlatch like white chiefs. The hooch, graft, main industries of Snohomish, cesspool town on skids, hornet-mad law hordes surround kids' beer party near Halmo High School. Boys flee. Gorilla-brained Boyd, who hunts the wren and shuns the eagle, uses shots from a trusty old .45 to freeze them in their tracks. But boys and girls read big boob-pitched ads in Everett Daily Whale Wrapper that make Rainier beer seem both a hairy-chested he-man's aperitif and a soft-voice ingenue's favorite snort. Huge billboards depict youngsters toting Olympia beer to picnics on their bikes or clustered round pianos as It's the Giggle Water enhances spiritual melodies. Subscribers will note that lately we've been setting part of the Free Press in capital letters without apparent reason. But we always have a reason, and often several reasons for all we do. Old Canine, the dog, has been down for months. Its metal pot won't heat. Subscriber Feifeld can't fix it. We have no other subscriber who can. And here is our modest little paper, struggling hard to survive, replete with enemies, which must pitch understandably to members of dozens of other weird cults. Methodists, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Lutherans, Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Scientists, Atheists, Brothers of Mammon, professional politicians, Mohammedans, Buddhists, to name only a few. Characters who never buy Free Press oft say, why should I pay Hugo in Fry a dime for a sheet of paper when I can get huge newspaper he calls Everett Daily Whale Wrapper for the same price? Why indeed? Why pay a few $1,000 for a 5-carat diamond when you can buy a truckload of rocks for far less? More people do. God and the universe are identical. We deny both personality and the transcendency of God. If omniscient, he'd know these things. If omniscient, he'd stop them. Eccentricity and nonconformity are not insanity. It is but an American privilege. Apparently, the mental institution has become, in certain quarters, a sort of inquisitionary device for punishing nonconformists. No human being, in or out of office, should resort to such tactics.
John Patric, the Diogenes of Avenue D, mankind's failings he would deride. As his epitaph proclaims, this man of many names was eccentric but justified. John was not the type to fake a smile or wish his acquaintances well, and he adopted his pen name Hugo in Fry to tell us all to go straight to hell. Now Hugo in Fry was not a nice guy. He was an ornery and a grizzled old mess. the scourge of the Sodomish sewer gangsters, peddling his Saturday evening free press. He may be sneering at us still from the other side. He was eccentric, but justified. Dr. Derriere du Cheval made it hard to be his pal. He thought a man should be as good as his word. He'd fire off a nasty note, and if you really got his goat, he might mail you a dead rat or bird. It was on his own terms that he lived and he died. He was eccentric but justified. The Reverend Thuja Placata was a grumpy old rotter with no patience for a blowhard or a liar. Like Diogenes of yore, fakes and phonies made him sore. He'd wish them torment and eternal fire. He knew godly folk could be ungodly, and politicians always lied. He was eccentric but justified. It seemed that running for governor was John's favorite sport. He was accused of insanity, but he won his case in court. They couldn't censure him or kill him, no matter how they tried. He was eccentric but justified. So raise a glass to John Patric, whether sent down below or born to heaven on the wings of a bird. He raised hell for many years, so shed him no tears. Take up his weapon, the well-written word. He left his mark in the world. It was a hell of a ride. He was eccentric but justified. He was eccentric but justified.